All right. Thank you, everyone. What a fantastic way to start our time together today. And it's going to be leading into some equally fantastic time for the second panel. And to introduce the panelists and to moderate our session, I'm going to invite to the stage Judith Roden, President Emerita of the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the past president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Judith, come on up.
Thank you, Chris. I thought you were going to introduce me as the chair of the NAM Grand Challenge on Climate and Health, which is the role I think that I'm most excited about in being with all of you today. You heard a little bit, actually, in the first panel about some of the products already of the work streams of the Grand Challenge, in hearing the terrific work that Renee led on the gaps in research and the materials that have been provided really to lay out a framework for where a new research agenda could be formed at this intersection. And of course, from Teddy, one of the work streams is communications, and their work, which she described so eloquently, is part of trying to reach a communications strategy, cut through the noise, and allow both health professionals, climate experts, but also the general public access and utilize the knowledge. But I have the privilege today of forging a new topic, actually, something which isn't part of our 5 work stream agenda in the Grand Challenge. And that is to begin to focus, and we will, in the Grand Challenge, and the expertise of these panelists will be so helpful, on the promise and the peril of AI. And certainly, I don't have to tell you that artificial intelligence and conversations about how it's going to be used really is already rapidly changing economies, and it certainly will influence how people live and how people work. AI is being deployed, and the acceleration of this deployment is breathtaking at times across sectors. And as this is happening, I think society is recognizing that we face a defining challenge, and that is how to harness its potential, which is enormous, to improve lives, to drive productivity, while confronting, I think, with it really in a clear-minded way, its potential to either narrow or increase global divides, its potential to improve or erode sustainability and human health, and its potential to either improve or widen inequality, or all of the above. These are really the meta issues. Its continuing deployment will require confronting challenges to privacy and accountability, and to do it at a moment when trust in public institutions is clearly eroding. So all of these challenges, I think, are issues that our panelists are confronting and thinking deeply about. We will today really focus on where it impacts the environment and its implications for health, and that health environment, that health climate change nexus. The panelists will explore how the health sector can harness the promise of AI while addressing its environmental impacts and also addressing its impact on health equity. Our panelists actually were picked because they represent different perspectives from health, from technology, from policy, and from the environmental communities, so that we can really examine this question through a number of very different lenses. To start us off, I'm delighted to introduce Amy Lurs, who is the Senior Global Director for Sustainability, Science, and Innovation at Microsoft. Amy has a wide range of prior positions focusing on the environment, focusing on climate change at the White House, in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, with the Skoll Global Health Threats Fund, and at Google. So Amy, let me turn this over to you, and then I'll invite the remaining panelists to come up after you're finished.
Does this work? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Judy, and it's great to be here. Um, I this is a complex topic, and inevitably, people in the room have different connections to AI and climate and the like. So I'd like to just take a quick survey of the room to see where people stand, given the title of the panel. How many in the room think AI is a big problem for climate change? Can you raise your hand? Whoa, everybody. Okay, that's good. Good to be a good discussion. How many of you think that it is going to has the potential to that it will be a big driver of, it has the potential to address big challenges and accelerate solutions to climate change? Okay, good. So I'm gonna you'll see my perspectives on this, and it seems like it kind of will reflect the room when I see those hands. And I'll start off by telling my key messages in case someone have to leave or you're going to drift off, because there is a lot of information. The first point is that AI is essential to accelerating needed climate, health, and equity solutions. My second point is that realizing its full potential requires intentional and proactive actions, and I will highlight some of those that I think that they are. And the third is the risk of inaction. I believe, having worked on climate change for almost 30 years, I really believe that the not acting on AI for climate change and climate and health issues is actually irresponsible. And I think we really have to figure out how to do it. Right. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to sort of breaking up in 3 different sections. The first section is just talking about the climate and health equity nexus. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think the next section, which is on opportunities, risks, and responsibilities, is really what people are interested in. But just to kind of get people on the same page, I'm going to go quickly through this, and then we can come back to it if there are questions. So climate change is really a public health crisis. There's so many different issues and data points that are coming out in various, on various topics, very sensitive. And whether it's from extreme weather, from food security, from infectious disease, from increased wildfires. Wow, this is really, anyway, there are lots of them. Is this on this wasn't happening before, so I don't know what happened, but I'm not going to touch it. And the impacts, yeah, this is on can you see if it's on a timer of sorts? And the impacts are felt equally around the world. This is a figure from the IPCC, or modified version, that really highlights the variation of the types of risks and the various different people who are vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to these risks. And I'm sure if you're working on any version of this on climate or health, you've probably seen some version of slides showing these disparities. And if you look at it broad of the globe, of course, you miss the fact that actually, even in some of the most wealthy countries in the world, there is variability in terms of where the vulnerabilities are and how people will be affected. And so I chose just 2 of these to highlight the contrast to not everybody is equally affected on everything, right? So the infectious diseases versus economic and productivity losses. And there are aspects that, of course, is that something you can figure out? It's going to be a bummer. I'm going to wait because it's going to be. Do you need me back there to? So there's a really key nexus between these areas, but AI, in the area of AI, really has opportunities in this sector. I will say that I first started working on the intersection of climate and AI about or climate in the digital sphere and health about 20 years ago when I was working at Google. And there I was focused on this One Health initiatives, and I was the climate and environment person. And our focus was looking at not so much AI, but digital technologies in helping to connect digital technologies and science to advance and address some climate challenges. And so it's been interesting for me to watch the advances in this space since that time, which has been just dramatic because things are moving so quickly at this intersection. And science and policy can't quite keep up, but the intersection together is moving quite quickly. So again, I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but I want to first just make sure we're all talking about what AI is. So broadly speaking, there are lots of different, thank you, definitions of AI, but broadly speaking, it refers here to computer systems that can perform tasks that are typically require human intelligence. And these AI technologies are often characterized in two ways, as predictive and generative. And both are valuable in the context of climate and health. I just want to kind of highlight the difference here because they are used in different ways. So predictive uses data to predict future outcomes. And they're typically smaller focused data sets they build on and smaller focus and optimize on more specific tasks. Generative AI are trained on much larger data sets, much more diverse data sets, and they learn to then generate new data, new text, new images, new simulation. And that difference is really important in terms of how you can use them, but also how you govern them, and the implications for energy. And I would say that both of these are really important for advancing in climate and health equity issues. And they're so important because what I like to call AI's 3 game-changing capabilities for issues around climate, and I would extend that to climate, health, and equity issues. The first is that AI has the ability to predict, manage and optimize complex systems that are really increasingly becoming too complex for traditional analytical tools. And the second is that AI is really can excel at accelerating development of new solutions, new vaccines, new materials, new products that can really drive rapid speed in solutions deployment and development. And the third is empowering the workforce. So there are right now, there are statistics, I don't remember these, but in terms of access to healthcare, how many doctors there are and how many people they need. These kinds of tools can really expand the reach and the power of the workforce working in these areas. I want to give just a little bit of a flavor of these. We'll go through these quickly, but this is actually a model that the team at Microsoft developed with researchers from around the world that is using AI-based tools, generative AI-based tools, to develop models, predictive models, to forecast with accuracy and spatial resolution that is really step changes from where we were before. And the interesting thing is it also can do it faster and with less computational cost. So the operations of these is actually not only can be used more broadly, but it's also lower energy costs and lower financial costs for those users. So it really allows you to expand the access to these kind of tools in ways that used to be much more centralized in much bigger central locations. And this is less in my field, but I wanted to highlight one of the things is I put the dates here on these papers because it's almost like every month there's a new thing that's really cool that I like, oh, wow, there's a new thing that's happening in this space. And this one is a model that looks at a wide range of diseases and is able to predict 1,000 plus, it says 100, it actually should say 1,000 plus diseases up to a decade out. And so this is really transformative. It's just in early stages now. It's not operational. I want to highlight that. But it is illustrative of how these kinds of advances can really enable earlier interventions and transform how we do health planning, especially in the area of climate where things are changing so quickly. So AI is also transforming vaccine development. We've seen this with, of course, COVID, where we all know there was an advance of that. But research is also showing in a wide range of areas where advances are happening. Again, this is really important because we need that rapid change as the climate and disease dynamic evolves. And the third area is empowering the workforce. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are a huge range of ways that AI can support, from doing administrative work, helping equip workers on the front line, accelerating learning, and closing equity gaps by using these tools to actually find biases in the space. Now, I highlighted these 3 game-changing capabilities that I see are so powerful and what we need to really hone in on to be able to capture the potential here. But I want to highlight that you can't just put AI out in the world and capture all of those and be successful. Here are a few requirements that I see that are really critical if we want to capture those 3 potentials across a wide range of opportunities. One, you need to invest in AI for climate, health, and equity solutions. So AI can have this potential, but if you don't invest and start targeting to that, then we're not going to, of course, realize those options. Oftentimes people say, I hear a lot about potentials, but what, I don't see anything happening. I'm like, well, people aren't investing and targeting it enough. And when you think about the climate crisis, really the climate crisis is about, solving the climate crisis is about identifying those potentials and then making them reality. And so that's what we need to do with AI. So building inclusive and representative data infrastructure and digital connectivity so people can use it. Expanding access to carbon-free electricity and supporting local communities. I'll get into that in the next section. Upskilling and increasing access to AI technologies for health workers and others. And integrating AI into decision-making effectively. And finally, governing AI for alignment with people and planet. And I'll touch on those in the next section. So now let's go to the era of AI and risks. I see the biggest risk of AI is that it's entering into a high carbon, high polluting, inequitable social technological system. At the basis of our whole society is widespread biases, social, economic, and power inequities. On top of that is a fossil fuel energy system that leads to lots of greenhouse gases, air pollution, and uses a lot of water. And on top of that, the infrastructure which supports much of society in terms of energy, water, and communications is old and outdated and needs to be expanded. These foundational issues are really critical in terms of shaping how other industries fit into this world. And data centers and digital infrastructure are newer, but are a critical part of the infrastructure for society. You think about COVID and how much it shut down the world. Think about if there was a digital virus and shut down data centers. Think about the economic, health, political, national security implications of that. This is really critical infrastructure, and we need to recognize that as we move forward. And healthcare sits on top of that, right? Healthcare, because it sits on top of that, has all of the implications of what happens below it. And AI is being dropped on top of that. That's the biggest risk. The biggest risk is what's in that black box. And that's the challenge, the ultimate challenge of what we have to do when we address these crises. We have to ultimately transform, drive the system change in that black box. But we can't do that overnight. Political headwinds certainly make that more difficult every day. But we have to also change above. We have to change things in the short term while we make those bigger changes in the long term. And so just to highlight, so whenever a system sits on this infrastructure, this old foundational systems that are creating these challenges, it reflects those. So for example, take healthcare. The healthcare sector saves lives. I couldn't find exactly numbers, improves well-being, people all over the world. But it also releases greenhouse gases, 2 to 3 gigatons of CO2 a year. It also releases air pollution, 4.6 million DALYs. Someone remind me what adjusted. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm climate. So, and then it also perpetuates the inequities that are the basis of our society. We have to remember that as we go through this system. So if you think about this, compare this to data centers and AI. These are estimates of just the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, comparing AI, data centers and its networks, including embodied emissions, and the healthcare sector. And you can see the healthcare sector is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what I want to highlight here is that all sectors have to decarbonize. All sectors have to decarbonize. The biggest part of that is the bottom part of that, those foundational institutions, right? That's the challenge. Now, so you might say, so then if you look at tools like AI tools like Copilot or ChatGPT, these by themselves are not major contributors. You already saw that in the last slide because I was comparing it to the health sector. But this just gives you some comparison of the energy use. So if you look at global energy use for ChatGPT to respond to all the queries in the world, which right now the most recent estimate is about 2.5 billion queries globally. And I have here a typical query and a long query. And this compares to how much energy is used to just watching TV in the US. 0.5% of the energy used for just watching TV in the US. I highlight this really to point out that there's so many things that use energy that we just don't pay attention to, right? The healthcare sector, to watching TV, idle appliances. And then when you go to water, here's another thing that we don't pay attention to. Water, the energy sector and the water sector are really connected. When you use energy, you use water. And this is why when you look at this figure, we have US television watching. That same number now translated into water. The only reason it looks so small is because leaking pipes and hamburgers uses so much water. So in perspective, the issue here, when we hear about the water for ChatGPT, famous line is 500 milliliters of water every time you have a conversation, that's many queries, and that is 87% due to electricity. So I think we need to recognize these intersections and that system in which this whole thing is sitting. So then you might say, well, how can you understand these headlines if that's true? Well, one of the key issues is that data centers are very concentrated. I love this figure on the left from the International Energy Agency, which shows the concentration of different industries. And you can see all the way on the right and the bottom are data centers, which account for only 0.5% of global emissions, but they're the most concentrated. Where you go out below, 0.7% of global emissions is steel. That uses so much more energy, but because it's so much more distributed, you don't have people yelling about the amount of energy using unless you're really in the climate space. Then you know that steel is a big deal. But the issue is, the real challenge is that it is true in local areas where data centers are being built rapidly, they can account for, because they're so concentrated, a big percentage of local energy. And when it grows really rapidly, that can strain a system, especially because our electricity grids and water systems are outdated and need to be modernized, right? So these are essentially infrastructure issues. They're not climate change issues. They're important issues. They're critical issues. They're equity issues, but they're not climate issues. And so I really want to highlight this issue of the difference of these local infrastructure issues and highlight in that context, there's increasing information and data on the air pollution implications of more energy needed, which can result in more air pollution where those power plants are and downstream of those power plants. And that is principally the result of the running of the energy systems. And so we need to make sure that we can drive fast changes in our energy infrastructure. So that brings me to area of AI and responsibilities. This is a paper that I was involved in now a number of years ago, came out in 2022, where about 20 of us, 25 of us from around the world, from different sectors, explored, this is before the explosion of ChatGPT, explored how does AI and digitalization likely to affect climate? And what we did is we came up with 3 characteristic scenarios, which you can see here. And you can see here that these are intertwined with issues like democracy and political agency, equity, planetary stability. You can't separate these because of that infrastructure that I mentioned before, that foundational system. And any solutions that we have has to look at all of these. But importantly, if you look here, this was even in 2022, a really key message that came out of this collaboration is that AI and digital technologies really has this potential of accelerating our emissions reductions. Now, whether it's a world we want to live in or not, that depends on governance, which led to really thinking about what is the responsibility for getting us into that, getting on that green decarbonization path and using AI. There are lots of responsibilities, just to mention a few. Ensure equitable access and representative tools, understand and address this stress on local communities, minimize resource use and source sustainably, target tools to address AI, climate, and health. And again, I would say that another key question that we need to ask ourselves is it responsible not to develop AI to tackle climate change and address climate health equities? These issues of how we understand this was the basis of another collaboration that actually I helped convene together with the National Academy of Sciences, which looked at ultimately what came out of that was this development of this Earth alignment principle, which was really focused on how do we develop a framework to advance AI development that is aligned with planetary health, equity, and social trust. And we highlighted with these 3 areas. I don't have time to go into this. Happy to share the paper and discuss it further. But I want to put this in context of the challenge that we have here. This is basically where we're headed on the existing challenges. And if you've worked on climate change for a long time, this flattening of the curve of projections is actually pretty exciting because 20 years ago it was much steeper, right? But we're still very far off from where we need to be. 40 gigatons gap if we look out to 2035, if we stay on this trajectory. And going back to those fundamental systems, to get to that gap, we can't get to it with just tweaking around the edges and efficiencies. We need fundamental changes. We need changes that are going to really transform that system. 5 to 6 times much carbon-free power, 75% less carbon-intensive industrial materials, and 1,000x times more durable carbon removal. We can't do these, I don't believe, without the power of AI. Think about just an example, one company that we invest in called Line Vision is using AI to enhance dynamic line rating and is able to increase transmission capacity by as much as 40%, which can help then bring in renewables. This, if you know much about the electricity system, expanding and modernizing the grid is a huge cost and large bureaucratic process. So if you can just go in and expand capacity by 40%, that's huge. And there are lots of other things here too where AI is enabling, and I'm not going to go into those detail, but happy to share other ideas. But the main point is there are studies that are now beginning to characterize how much of this reduction can AI actually empower. And so this is combining 2 studies and looks at, just if you look at those tools that are out today and you scale those, there's the estimates today so far can cut at least 15% of global emission gaps by 2035. Again, that's only a partial analysis. In a paper that I wrote just published just a couple weeks ago, compiled these and really made this case of saying we really need AI to address this challenge and outlined what I thought was needed, and looks at this, then compares what are the emissions from the data centers compared to the reduction potential. And that's what we need to be able to quantify more effectively, both to target our investments on research and development, but also just to inform policy. So just to end, I just highlighted a few areas where I think it's really important, where research, innovation, and action are needed. I'm not going to go through these now, but I think I would just close with saying that AI is not a silver bullet, but it is essential to match the scale and urgency of climate and health challenges. And with intention and care and proactive action, I really think it can help drive inclusive and equitable solutions. Thank you.
I'll ask Amy to stay and invite our other panelists up to the stage if you would. I think Amy has given us a terrific framing and a kind of speed course on AI, which has been exceptional. With that framing, I'm going to ask each of the three panelists to speak briefly from their perspectives. And then I will moderate a discussion among them. Let's turn to a more specific focus on health with our first panelist, Vivian Lee. Vivian is a professor at both the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Medical School, and her broad expertise spans building several health tech businesses while she was at Google. She also served as Dean of the University of Utah Health Center and also Chief Scientific Officer at NYU. After Vivian, we'll broaden the aperture further with our second panelist, Yuri Dvorkin, who is at Johns Hopkins, and he's in the Department of both Civil and Systems Engineering and Electrical Computing Engineering. He's also the US Director of the NSF Global Climate Center on Electric Power Innovation for a Carbon-Free Society. And then we'll call on Tamara Neese, our final panelist, who's the director of the Climate, Technology, and Justice Program at the Data and Society Research Institute. And Tamara had previous roles both at Intel and on the faculty of the University of San Francisco. So let's start with Vivian. You can speak from your chair or up here as you wish.
Okay, I'm happy to speak from here if you all can see me. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to everything that I'm going to learn beyond what Amy just shared with us. My background is in healthcare, and I trained as an engineer before I went to medical school, but I am very new to the sustainability world. So with that, I'm going to start with my presentation here and say that, but even though I'm new to it, I have made very good and very fast friends in this field. And so I'd like to start by sharing with you some work that we just published really last week, right? It just came out. It was released a little bit early in time for Climate Week. And one of my co-authors, Chetan Sarabu, is here. And so if you have any questions, you can direct them straight to him. This is a piece that is intended to really be directed to health system leaders, to people who are making decisions about the use of AI in the clinical settings, recognizing that we're going to be a large consumer of generative AI, and to offer a framework for how these decision makers and how these purchasers of generative AI tools and other AI tools might be thinking about those decisions in order to drive to a more sustainable model. So I'm going to highlight just a few of the takeaways of this paper. So you heard from Amy that we in healthcare are large contributors to the carbon footprint. Even though our mantra is to do no harm, we produce about 8.5% of emissions approximately. And if you think about this kind of at a macro level, US healthcare emissions are approximately equal to, or maybe slightly exceed, the emissions of all of the United Kingdom, just all of the United Kingdom, not just healthcare. So to give you a sense of that. So there are huge opportunities. Now, when we think about the ways in which we quantify or start to consider the contributions or the emissions that come from our use of generative AI, we can think about it. It's complicated to measure. Yuri's the expert here, and I'm not, but just to give you a sense of it, there's, of course, the development of the large language model and the training phase of the large language model. Those are very energy intensive, but fortunately, they don't happen that frequently. But where our roles and our application of these tools do make a difference is in that inference phase. So even though the overall resource use might be relatively low, our frequent usage of it can make a big difference. So just order of magnitude, give you a sense of it, for an AI-powered MRI interpretation, that's about 0.5 grams of carbon compared to 14,000 grams for producing the MRI itself. Now, of course, we're not doing tons and tons of MRIs, but if you think about the AI-powered clinical note or email generation, once you start multiplying these small numbers, they can get really fast, grow very high, very fast. And to give you a sense of that, one of our co-authors, Udit Gupta, who's at Cornell, helped us work out this one scenario to get a sense of just how much one deployment of a large language model in a clinical setting might contribute to emissions, and how much our decisions about how to do that implementation really matter. So this is a case study of a typical academic health system, let's say with 3,000 physicians who might be wanting to use a large language model to generate responses to those emails that they receive every day from patients. Maybe they just want to get a draft of that email first. So let's say around 50 messages per day is the scenario we looked at here. And let's say they might use ChatGPT 4 to help draft those emails. And the ChatGPT 4 is operating on a data center that is sort of average for the country. And I know this is a very complicated table, and please look at the original paper if you want more details, but just to call out maybe the key takeaways. If you think about using large language models for these doctors to generate 50 messages a day, where the context for the large language model is, let's say, the 10 previous clinical notes about that patient, so that the ChatGPT has some idea of what's going on with that patient, it can draft a reasonable note. And we're using a typical data center with GPT-4, then the annual emissions for that scenario for these doctors would be around 150,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide, or in tree years, which I can relate to better, frankly, about 7,000 tree years. So that's kind of the base case. And now if we just adapt that a little bit and say, well, maybe instead of a GPT-4-like model, we can simplify, maybe a 3.5 level model is sufficient for generating these notes. And if we can go to the more optimized data centers using more renewable energy, the annual contribution is reduced significantly from 7,000 down to 117 tree years. So these decisions we make about how we implement these models are really huge. And I think just starting to create that awareness is going to be very important. So in this framework that my co-authors and I've helped to put together, this Sustainably Advancing Health AI framework, we think about there being 4 key levers for optimizing. The first is just at the level of the application itself. So ask ourselves, do we even need generative AI for certain applications? I always like to talk about, if you want to do math, if you want to do calculations, actually large language models are not that great. Actually, they're really bad at that. A calculator is much better. So think about whether you really need generative AI, and then also think about when, the timing of the computational task to optimize efficiency. So there's some application questions, and then there are model questions. So just like in the case study, leaner models in many use cases are going to be preferred. Math reduction techniques, you don't need to do math to all those bits, and even specialized chips that can reduce the computational overload. And then there's the data center efficiency. So where are these data centers, and what are their energy sources? And as consumers, as purchasers, we can imagine RFPs where we go out and we ask these vendors, oh, what data centers are you using? And are those data centers relying on renewable energies? That's how we as big consumers can actually really start to move the dial here. And then finally, there are these overall policy and governance questions around measurement approaches, transparency requirements. Can we have all of the vendors held to a consistent standard of reporting so that we can be informed purchasers? So we do want to advocate for building a coalition around this, and there are many opportunities for us to partner. And I want to just finish with a couple of thoughts, really building on, this is Amy's paper that she mentioned that just came out a couple of weeks ago, hot off the press. And she has this framework for 5 actions to think about realizing the promise of AI overall, so not just in healthcare. And I thought I would just build on that specifically within health. And most of these, I think, are pretty self-evident, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but we definitely need to invest in AI for health. Amy started to illustrate the many applications and use cases. We need to build inclusive data and digital connectivity. We need that in general with interoperability and better access to, for example, electronic health record data. Minimize our resource uses, which is exactly what this paper is talking about, how to think about that. Upskilling the workforce. Our workforce is quite risk averse in healthcare. And so in order to ensure that we're responsible users of this, we need to really educate and train. And then I think probably the most important for me as a former health system leader and somebody who's really taking the perspective of how do we influence health systems to use AI and to use AI responsibly and to care, frankly, about the environmental impact of the work that we do. I think we really need to align how we think about AI with the overall triple aims or the overall priorities of our existing health systems. We have to create that alignment. And so I just offer some of the things that are top of mind right now for many health system leaders as areas that we can try to concentrate and focus some of that AI research and development on. So we all know that our health system is incredibly expensive and our outcomes are really poor. We are extreme outliers compared to the rest of the country and tons of opportunity there. And beyond that, this consideration is going to get worse and worse with the aging population. So thinking about how our health system is failing our seniors and will probably continue to be more challenged. Huge opportunities around just reducing waste. Our administrative spend is around 20 to 30%. A typical doctor, $99,000 a year of billing and coding just to support one primary care doctor. About half of all of that administrative spend is considered waste, so huge opportunities for AI and generative AI there. And then, of course, we have clinician burnout, our huge workforce challenges. These are all already opportunities that people are taking advantage of, but there's much more that can be done here. So with that, I will stop. Oh, and on the topic of waste, if you haven't seen this video, I'm not going to play this video now, but if you haven't seen this, this is one woman, an artist from the Netherlands, who collected all of the materials that were used for a breast reconstruction operation, one operation that she underwent. So just to drive home the opportunities for reducing waste, for using AI to help us in healthcare reduce our carbon footprint and be better stewards of the environment. Huge opportunities. So with that, thank you very much.
Very good.
Hello, everybody. One advantage of speaking not first, not second on such an event is that I don't have to cover a lot of material because my colleagues have done such a wonderful job. Still, if I cannot make this talk very informative, I will try to make it entertaining. So these are the two hockey sticks curve that are very common. On the left-hand side, you see the global growth of demand that all over the world, in Europe, China, the United States, we have a very quick, unprecedentedly quick uptake of AI demand, basically how much electricity we consume to either develop, deploy, or use AI. And what is important here is that the very similar rates of growth our country has experienced in 1950s, 1960s. And decades after, we had either flat or a very moderate 1% growth. The hockey stick on the right shows the global temperature rise. And this is also a fairly familiar trend that we've been exposed to over the past decade and a half. And to a certain extent, there is no surprise. The reason why these two sticky curves became so popular and displayed together in the past 2-3 years is the reasons which Amy highlighted in her talk related to the fact that our infrastructure, primarily energy infrastructure, and is not up to par to deal with the two challenges at the same time. It cannot decarbonize as quickly as we need to decarbonize the electric sector, and it cannot support the deployment of AI at the scale that it needs. However, dealing with the two hockey sticks has four similar features. First of all, the scale and the speed both of energy transition and adoption of AI is enormously low. Am I doing? Oh, I'm sorry. Is enormously important to get done in pod. The other thing is that the likelihood of success has real stakes at play, right? We're very good at measuring, we're getting better at measuring the impacts of climate change. There are studies which help us to evaluate the social cost of carbon, and that helps us to at least underwrite some climate risk. We're not yet as good as measuring the risk of AI technology, whether it's in technological space or whether it is in a social space, but we're getting there. And the other thing which is important to emphasize here is that both transitions are exceptionally costly, so we don't have large tolerance to mistakes. We need to make sure that the decision that we make now will be efficient not only today, but also later down the road. That is very true of the electric power sector because it's very capital intensive and it takes years to recover the expenses. And what you can see here is the complexity of the problem that decision makers have to deal with. On the left-hand side, you have the bubbles which represent planned deployment of US data centers, and the size of the bubble represents the power capacity that needs to be drawn from the right diagram, which shows the various generation technologies that produce electricity in the United States. And the first thing that you can see, and that it was presented by Amy on her slide in a slightly different form, is that the location of power plants and the location of data centers do not necessarily correlate. Data centers are very concentrated indeed, and you have clusters across the East Coast. You probably have heard about the Virginia data center alley. For the generation technologies, what you can see is that certain technologies are concentrated. For example, wind power, which is the blue curves. And you imagine if we decarbonize electric power grid, the key issue would be to bring all this renewable power from the places in the middle of the country where it's being produced to the places where the data centers are located. So we need to solve a management task. We need to manage the data infrastructure and the power infrastructure. What are the problems? The problems right now is the uncertainty. We don't really know for sure if all the red bubbles on the left diagram, which represent data centers, will be needed. Because every day we learn about a new way to produce AI more efficiently, whether this efficiency coming from algorithmic improvements. For example, that's what DeepSeek did. Whether this innovation come from better chips that we can deploy and we can use AI more efficiently, or whether it's coming from, for example, better ways to cool data centers. And obviously, not single technological innovation is taken by itself. We could, for example, take advantage of better chips and better algorithms or better cooling or any various combination of those techniques. So what we need to be mindful is something also Amy highlighted in her talk is about the distributional impacts. Because due to the fact that we can manage these infrastructures, due to the fact that they have different collocated and uncollocated resources, the parties that collect the benefits, reap the benefits, and absorb the cost of these technologies are very different. And here is an example. The state of California gets more than $50 billion in tax revenue from the big tech. The state of Virginia, which is the home to the largest number of data centers in the United States, absorbs roughly $150 million in extra healthcare costs, let alone that additional premature death by 2030 due to the deployment of data centers in Virginia or nationwide is going to be estimated at around 1,300 people. So the need here is to better understand what are the impacts between power to AI to climate. And we've done a really good job. Here you have our work that evaluates the impact of data center on carbon emissions under different policies that are now being revisited and discussed as part of greenhouse gas protocol. One is matching based on annual basis, one is matching based on hourly phasing. But the important thing is, depending on where you source your electricity will affect your impact. And that's not something that we do on a regular basis, because to a large extent, consumers, us residential consumers and industry consumers, they still take electricity for granted. So what matters here is that while we improve the ability to account the carbon impacts of the AI sector by better bringing domain grid knowledge, for example, transmission constraints, another reference to your talk, and the vision technology, line vision technology. What we need to keep in mind is that the majority of health impacts are localized and driven by local pollutants, NOx, SOx, particulate matters, and so on and so forth. And we're not as good at understanding what these impacts are and downscaling them to community level. What is ironic to me is that AI offers personalized medicine, but the impacts AI are very hard to downscale to an individual person. And that's exactly the challenge that we are working on. If there is one message that I would like you to carry away to home, is that we need to have a holistic life cycle assessment of AI in America. That resonates well with all the presentations that I've heard today. But we also need to bring this LCA knowledge into informed decision-making, whether it's policy, whether it's business, whether it's something that plans for art. We need to have a way to advance knowledge that we generate as we go to practice very quickly, something that we're not very good at dealing at.
Oh, I don't. How do I not screw this up? Okay, okay. No. I think I went too far. Oh. Okay.
Tomorrow was the first one.
You have slides?
Yeah.
I don't know. Weird. You know what? I was actually going to forego slides anyway. So we will just, okay, so I will preface my comments by saying that I am a qualitative researcher. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is really looking at those community level, localized impacts to public health and economics related to data centers and other related AI infrastructures. So I also should note that I'm a little bit of a downer sometimes. I wrote an entire book about death, and so this may be a little bit dark, but I still think that there's a lot that we can do. And Yuri, we definitely should talk about holistic assessments. And so to frame a little bit of the work that I'm doing right now at Data and Society, where I lead the Climate Technology and Justice Program, I have some funding from the NSF and from the Internet Society Foundation to conduct research specifically looking at how communities are impacted by AI infrastructures and trying to go beyond those quantitative measurements of energy, carbon, and water costs, although of course we need better transparency and international standards around those forms of measurement, but to really look at the human rights impacts of data centers and energy infrastructures from their perspective in order to build a more holistic framework for analysis. And I've been working also with Emma Strubel at Carnegie Mellon, who you probably also know. So yes, we should talk more about that. So as part of our process, we hold participatory workshops with community members to really try to get the perspectives of community members to policymakers in particular, and to local officials who might already be hearing a lot of great things about data centers and all of the economic benefits that they can bring from the data center lobby and from utility companies who are also definitely benefiting from data center build out. And so, beyond just looking at the kind of lab focused metrics of carbon cost, we're really trying to think about the impacts of pollution on people and ecologies. And so one thing that I think has been really important to think about is the relationship between life cycle analysis as a tool for really thinking about the entire supply chain that goes into AI production. And we're also thinking about mining and manufacturing and all of the pollution associated with those, as well as the extraction of critical minerals and the human rights abuses that pop up in places like the DRC. And also thinking about the effects of e-waste. So GPUs, of course, are incredibly energy intensive and also tend to be used up much faster. And so what does it mean if we have a proliferation of e-waste? How can we work on building circularity into design? And then another thing that I think is really important, so when we're talking about net zero commitments and having worked at Intel on a sustainability team, we did talk a lot about the importance of net zero and really trying to reach our 2030 goals about responsible technology development. But in many cases right now, big tech companies are really rescinding a lot of their initial net zero pledges and commitments, and even taking sustainability pages off of their main websites. And so I'm a little bit worried about how AI will benefit this sort of net zero filled future if companies are really under a lot of political pressure right now to not care about things like that. And so the other question is what AI is actually being used for. And so there are a number of colleagues of mine who are working on really trying to map out the enabled emissions contributing to climate change. So I am thinking of people like Holly and Will Alpine at Enabled Emissions, who are former Microsoft workers, who are really looking at the relationship between oil and gas companies and AI. And so what does it mean if large tech companies are engaged in contracts with oil and gas companies that will lead to an acceleration of fossil fuel production? And so how do you map out those emissions also when you're thinking about carbon accounting? And I think we also need to be clear about what kinds of AI we're investing in. So we've been talking about the many very useful and vital and essential ways that AI can be beneficial, both when it comes to climate and health. But are we talking about really just expanding infrastructure for the sake of peddling ChatGPT and chatbots that are encouraging teenagers to kill themselves while providing overly helpful instructions about how to hang the noose, which is obviously a real thing that I'm not making up and is in a lawsuit against OpenAI. And so the other question I have about investing in technologies that can be beneficial for both climate and public health would be, how can we have AI in the public interest when our research institutions are being dismantled? So if the NIH and the NSF are being defunded and universities are under attack, I don't really trust private companies to come up with the kinds of projects that we need desperately. And instead, I think that what is happening right now is an overinvestment in data center infrastructure and build out rather than a really cautious assessment of what kinds of infrastructure we need and thinking very carefully about forecasting in a real way. And I would, I will also just say that, a lot of the lived effects of data centers, so just to give you a taste of what that actually looks like in a place like Data Center Alley in Virginia. So we're thinking about the ways that AI can disrupt everyday life. So if you have transmission lines cutting through a public park or cutting through farmland, you also have issues where you might have data centers in one state, but transmission lines are in another state. And so regulation in one state may not be completely reaching the people who are actually affected by transmission lines in a different state. And we also have a lot of issues where many of the data centers in the US are concentrated in places with a high degree of fossil fuel build out, and in places with fewer environmental protections and regulation. And so what we're seeing is that companies are using polluting fossil fuels, including coal and natural gas plants, in order to make up for the gap, even if, to some extent there are, of course, data centers that use renewable energy. And I live in California and, yeah, it's a little bit different there. We don't have the mega hyperscalers that you see in places like Louisiana. But what I do hear is talking to people, even in San Jose, who say that they can't sleep at night because they hear the noise from the data centers because of the diesel fueled backup generators, because of the cooling systems used for data centers in general. And I think the question of water, so if we're kind of thinking about quantifying the water use associated with data centers is one thing to think about it kind of on a global scale. But if you're looking at the local level in places like rural Mexico, where you do have people who are residents of a place who are essentially fighting with tech companies over water sources. And so just to give you a perfect example, to kind of end with the idea of how AI can be harmful, both because of its uses and its materialities, would be the XAI data center in Memphis, the Colossus data center. So in South Memphis, the gas turbines that are used to power the data centers for Grok, which is of course X's AI, which is known for its particularly racist and sexist applications. These turbines are polluting the air with thick smog and nitrogen oxide in a Black neighborhood that is already dealing with the effects of environmental racism. And residents are having asthma attacks and are saying that they can't leave their homes because of the smell that they are experiencing. And so X is flagrantly defying federal clean air permitting rules through a loophole. So if we think about the future of AI and what companies and governments should be investing in, we also need to think about what the actual human toll is, particularly at a time when investment in AI is, in my opinion, being used to justify the further deregulation of all of the environmental protections that we had kind of taken for granted.
Thank you. Well, I think we've had a very broad-ranging set of presentations, from really examining at the more macro level the kinds of energy and water usage of AI and data centers compared to other kinds of usages, some intentional and some unintentional, like pipes leaking, or hamburgers, which I loved on your slide, to the human implications of living in these areas and the implications both for mental and physical health. And the energy climate nexus has been widely discussed, and I think our conversation has really reflected the importance and the interest of that. I'd like to ask our panelists about the other area where I see people wringing their hands at the climate health nexus, and that is the workforce implications. Will we gain jobs? Will we lose jobs? Do we improve or disadvantage human health and improvements to affect climate change by how the workforce will be changed as a result of the use of AI? And just jump in. Right?
I'm a professor. I teach. I know OpenAI exists. ChatGPT is very helpful to create homework sets. I compare the average performance of students in my class over the past 2 years. Nothing has changed. So you need to have domain knowledge to use AI efficiently. And what I observed is that even though I encourage students to use AI, they try to do it in a smart way, as good students should. What I also found is that now I have exceptionally bad outcomes on the exam. If the average is the same, now the outcome, the lowest grades are lower. So somebody who is abusing the technology is not getting the full knowledge, they cannot perform well independently. To a large extent, this experience is something that I share with my other colleagues. So projecting educational experience into the workspace, I feel that it's very important to acknowledge both pros and cons. But one thing that we know in the energy sector that AI helps achieve is that it helps to bring knowledge very quickly, because an average power system engineer working in an average utility is about 47 years old. It means they finished college 25, 20 years ago, and they did not study a lot of things that we know today. They acquire this knowledge from post-educational training. They acquire this knowledge by doing the craft, but doing the job. But only AI helps to bring this knowledge very quickly to them. And that includes a lot of safety critical applications like wind power forecast, load forecast, the ability to do data analytics to identify power system assets which are needed for maintenance. So that really helps to improve not only their working conditions, but also the way how the entire infrastructure functions.
Anybody else?
Sure. That's such a big question. I think it is one that none of us really know exactly how it's going to impact. But we do know that it can impact all of the different elements of the workforce very differently. And hopefully, if we direct the effort in the right way, it can be quite positive. So, for example, when we look at overall clinician work hours today, I think I might have flashed up very quickly that on average, the average physician works 50 some, almost 60 hours a week. And at least about 20 of those hours are considered administrative waste time. They're not satisfying to the workforce. It's leading to this, record-setting retirements, early retirements, which are only exacerbating the fact that we have a shortage of healthcare providers going forward. So in that particular workforce, I would say we really need AI tools. The earliest are these ambient scribe tools. They're just really, I think, the tip of the iceberg in terms of how we can improve the performance of our clinicians and enable them to have a more satisfying professional life. I think there are an infinite number of possibilities in terms of how we can improve the overall functioning of our clinical teams and extending their ability to address, for example, the access shortages, how we can have our lean workforce now be able to serve more people more effectively is a huge, huge area of opportunity. There are other components of the workforce that I think will definitely be affected, and I really hope that they are in some ways. And I feel like, we had at one point when I was the CEO of our health system, we had more people in the billing and coding department than we had physicians in the hospital. And, we mostly have outsourced a lot of that work kind of across the country now, overseas. I want those people to be gainfully employed, so I'm not looking to increase unemployment, but I feel like that is an area of healthcare waste that we really need to address. And if we can do that with AI and agentic AI, for example, I think that's a huge opportunity. Probably the biggest thing that I think right now is that the most important thing is that everyone feels comfortable with AI and with the responsible use of AI and can learn and grow with the tools to enable their performance to improve, whether it's figuring out how to boil a soft-boiled egg, at home, or actually in the workplace, really improving your performance. If you're a marketing person or a writer or a clinician or a nurse, whatever you're doing, obviously physician or a nurse, I think this is an opportunity. And what I'm most concerned about is that our workforce, we're so overworked in healthcare that we don't have the time to pause, to learn, and to grow ourselves. And I think that should really be a priority.
Anybody else want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, so not to be a hater again, but so one of the issues that I'm seeing on the ground when I interview workers, so I just interviewed about around 50 tech workers from across the industry about the relationship between generative AI and climate within their workplace is. And a lot of people are being pressured to use generative AI in order to increase their productivity, but in some cases that can lead to extra work for them because they then have to go through and check for errors. And they find that their productivity is actually not increased, but they are having OKRs and other sort of metrics around their performance review tied to their use of AI. So there's a real push for that within tech companies, but then also talking to a lot of creative workers, and of course, all of my dear friends in higher ed who are worried that they're going to be essentially forced to use AI in ways that are maybe not useful. Right. And so what does it mean if we have a future in which students are handing in, AI generated papers and then faculty are grading them with AI? Like, what is the point? What are we doing here? And at a time when we see higher ed being devalued and different kinds of work being devalued, I think it's very important to not be totally enchanted by the possibilities of AI in everything, right? Like, what is AI actually useful for? Can we think about actual use cases? Can we fine tune models so that they're useful in a particular context? And instead of saying that everybody could have like a, a ChatGPT based therapist, which they should not.
Please, this is a conversation.
Yeah,
among you, so-
I think Tamara makes a very good point about this, and there's a Peterson Health Institute report from March of 2025, which basically says, we should have a framework for evaluating when we do deploy these tools, what impact is it really having? We should be hold the technology to a high bar. So they have a framework for looking at, is it improving physician or clinician productivity? Is it actually are we saving money? Are we improving the patient experience? And they're actually going through and trying to systematically kind of create a framework and set the expectation that as we deploy these, that we are very careful about measuring and monitoring so that we do know what its impact is. I think that is really important.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I mean, I think that we're doing a lot of that, of saying, how do you measure not just the energy and emissions of using something, but relative to if you did it before, and is it better, right? And I think that the interesting thing from a researcher's perspective, challenging thing for society and regulation is that as the tools become more complex, measuring that is actually very difficult. I know that there's a real scream to have more transparency from corporate sector. I will say that it is actually difficult to have a number of this per that. There are ranges of numbers. I really try to focus on ranges, but it's hard, and it will become more hard when you have agents that are working, and the computational effectiveness versus efficiency versus the value that is coming from that. I think that we tend to measure the efficiency of computation rather than the efficiency of added intelligence or added value. And that's where we need a lot of work to be able to do that. Some of the things that you talked about, I think, get to that, and there are some pieces to do that. But and I just want to add one other thing on that is, so I agree that we need those metrics, but also I really want to reinforce this issue of, we also need not just training, but like co-learning, because it's not like there's a playbook that, some tech company can come and say, this is how you do it. This is a new tool out there, and it's changing really quickly, and it has lots of powerful ways that it can help and lots of powerful ways that it can be destructive. And what we need to do is figure out what are those ways and learn together. And I think educational universities are really important. I've talked to a couple of universities about the idea of actually sort of co-designing a sustainability course with AI. Like, AI is part, how do you think about how to use it? You think about how it becomes a partner in thinking. And in that process, it's not like you teach the students how to use it, you're learning what this means in this space. I think that there's something there that the academic institutions could really help out with.
There is a lot of truth to it, and it actually manifests itself when we start talking about domain-specific foundation models. This is probably the best idea for the capstone project that there could potentially be. Requires to bring domain knowledge that existed in textbook in a lot of offline sources into the AI age, and essentially students and researchers work as translators from domain knowledge into the language of AI. How do we take into account the laws of physics, like Ohm's, Kirchhoff's law, if we're talking about the power grid? Or like, how do we take into account the laws of chemistry, like the mass balances, and translate that into something that AI model can reason for? I think you're talking across those ideas.
I want you to focus, let me ask you to focus on one other issue that I think we really do need to talk about, and that is that policymakers around the world, and I'm hearing these conversations all week here, are beginning to feel that they need to shape the rules that are going to govern AIs, and that it is government's responsibilities to do that and to make agreements with other governments, whether it's through treaties or sanctions, and the like. And what is your view working in this area about do we need regulatory frameworks? Do you trust government to create the policy that would make those regulatory frameworks? And what are the other levers that we may have at our disposal, particularly in the use of AI at the climate health nexus, that you think will help to advance and protect from the peril side that the policymakers are focusing on?
Yeah, I can start with that one. Yeah, so I think we definitely need international frameworks and standards for responsible AI development. And but at the same time, a lot of folks within tech companies will tell you that sometimes it can be quite hard to implement the things that are coming out of even the EU, right? So we're kind of looking towards Europe right now to do a lot of things that we're not doing in the US anymore. But it can be hard to ensure that policy is actionable. So I do think being able to understand how things really work within tech companies and understanding also how to do an impact assessment that is considering the different kinds of impacts that we've been talking about on communities on the ground was incredibly important. So I think trying to build policy frameworks that are really coming from the ground up is going to be increasingly important, particularly in the US right now. There's a lot happening, particularly around things like data centers at the state and the local level. And so, and even in deep red states, right? Like even in Indiana, there's been quite a lot of pushback against data centers from constituents. So I think that there is an opportunity to really think about bridging some of the kind of local experiences and local and state frameworks with the work that really does need to also happen at that international standards level.
Yeah, I really do believe that we have to think very carefully about strong regulatory frameworks here, because at the end of the day, we're really talking about trust. And for us to have trust in a technology that mostly just seems far beyond our grasp, we're going to need some very strong regulatory guidelines. I actually just came from a meeting just talking about the use of AI in clinical decision making. So physicians using Dr. ChatGPT and patients using Dr. ChatGPT, everybody's using it. And in this particular gathering, one of the graduate students put together a series of clinical scenarios and put it to about 10 of these different models just to see, would you intubate or would you not intubate here? Would you give this antibiotic? Would you not give this antibiotic? And surprising disparate answers coming from the different models. So that conversation really led us to think, well, we need to provide, as experts in this field, kind of going back to your domain experts, we need to provide some guidance to the regulators as to what are the values that we want to have represented in those regulations. How not, every AI implementation is different. And if they're going to be applying to the delivery of healthcare, I think that those of us who are in the healthcare space need to come up with some of the overarching guidelines, because I think Amy put it very nicely. I believe it was where we're putting AI on top of a pretty broken system, and to expect the AI to fix it is actually ridiculous. So we need to actually think hard about that. And right now in 50 states, there are 50 different pieces of legislation about regulating AI. There are about 35 that are already approved. So state by state, people are taking it in their own hands and making these regulations, which is going to make it almost impossible to really manage, just if you think about it from a vendor perspective or from even a health system perspective. So I think it's up to us to sort of step up and try to inform some of those and make sure that the regulations are hitting the spot where we need to hit them and protecting the values that are important to us.
Yeah, to build on that, I mean, we definitely need regulation, and I agree that there needs to be international standards. The challenge that I see is that I hinted at this before is the technology is moving so quickly that to think that policy is going to keep up with it, even in a on top of the issue that Vivian you were highlighting, I think that was more how you're even using it, right? So you need the experts to think about how you're using it, and then you need to also be planning that regulation for tomorrow. Like in the tech sector, you talk about, are you planning for tomorrow? Or are you planning for today? But because most of the regulations that are set in place, they're regulating what happened 10 years ago, right? I mean, that's a problem with climate change. With tech, it's a really big problem. And we see that, I think, I sort of see that playing out when customers come and ask Microsoft for things as new technologies come into the realm. Like, what is the implication of this? And the policy is way back, thinking about training, right? Whereas the people are thinking about agents working with agents to do, these complex tasks. I actually think as that gets more complicated, the efficiency in terms of value will be greater, like it'll be a more positive, but we need the evidence to be able to say that. And so I think you need to not only, you said, do you trust government? I'm not going to answer that question, but right now, but what I do know is you need the experts in the area, the field, and in the technologies to be able to look ahead.
Well, we are out of time, and I really want you to join me in thanking the panelists for a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you.